Well, and thank you very much, and I appreciate the invitation to come up here today. Actually, I have to tell you, I've been to Boston before. In fact, I got my undergraduate degree at the trade school in Cambridge. And I got two great things out of Massachusetts when I came up here to go to MIT. I got an undergraduate degree, and I managed to get a wife.
Same thing.
And my mother-in-law, actually, when I told her I was going to be here to speak this morning, she told me that actually she went to high school. I think her high school is like right across the street from here. And she's actually been pretty nice to me over the years, despite the fact that her daughter is considered kind of the black sheep of the family because she married a conservative. Now, before talking about the constitutionality, or I should say the unconstitutionality of the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, which I'm going to refer to as Obamacare, which I don't think you all mind that, right? Actually, I want to give a note of thanks to everybody in this room and to Massachusetts Citizens for Life. And it's not just because of your work against abortion, but because of the very important work of this organization on behalf of the First Amendment. Now, what am I talking about? Well, I spent 2 years on the FEC, as Ann said, as a recess appointee by President Bush on the commission. And you know, all of you have read about the Citizens United decision the Supreme Court issued last year, which was a very important decision that helped restore our rights to engage in political speech, a right that had been basically taken away by federal law and by Congress. But it was the pioneering work of this organization in the 1980s when Massachusetts Citizens for Life, with no budget, with no money, went to court and sued the Federal Election Commission, which was saying that this organization could not issue a voter guide. You know, a voter guide that rated everybody running in the state for political office, whether they were for or against abortion. And the federal agency, you know, was coming in and saying, well, you can't do that, that's against the law. And they went to court and they won the case in the United States Supreme Court. And that was one of the first cases that started pulling back the Federal Election Campaign Act, the federal law that I, unfortunately, was tasked with enforcing when I was on the FEC. And that was a very important case. So I thank you for that work that you did. Now, what did we just unfortunately mark on March 23rd? Well, it was the 1-year signing anniversary of Obamacare. I'm not going to say that we celebrated it, but we marked the date. Now, what's the worst features of this 2,000-page bill? Well, the worst thing in it is the individual mandate, which, as you know, required every American to purchase health insurance. By the way, at inflated prices. The estimate, one of the estimates I saw is it would cost up to $15,000 per family. And how is the federal government to enforce it? Through tax penalties imposed on you by the IRS, which are probably the worst 3 letters of the alphabet put together in America. Now, the sponsors of this bill, including President Obama, said that putting in an individual mandate that forced every American to purchase insurance was absolutely essential to this comprehensive reform plan because basically private insurance companies needed new coerced customers to be able to cover all the individuals that would now be added and to be able to provide all the new coverage that this law requires. By the way, when the Congressional Budget Office was asked to do a study on the cost of this bill, one of the essentials for the government to be able to pay for it was the fact that they estimated and hoped that enough Americans would refuse to purchase this insurance and therefore pay the penalty And it was that penalty, about $30 billion, that they estimated in IRS penalties would come in, that was used in the mathematics of figuring out how to pay for this. Okay, so they were hoping that a certain percentage of Americans would get penalized by it. As a policy matter, as I'm sure all of you agree, this is really a rotten deal. And I can tell you, under the real Constitution, the one put together by our founders and the framers of that great document, as opposed to the breathing, totally fungible, twisted version that liberals like, there's no doubt that this individual mandate in this bill is unconstitutional. The federal government has never, ever, in our entire history, required individual Americans to purchase or buy a product or a service. Even during World War II, when we probably faced the greatest danger this country has ever faced, when the government was selling war bonds, for example, right, to help finance the war, purchasing war bonds was voluntary. You know, there was no law passed that forced Americans to buy war bonds. There was no law passed to force farmers to grow and provide food for our troops. You know, there was no law passed that forced Americans to work in munitions plants, building tanks. Because despite the great danger we faced, I mean, no one at that time in Congress believed that Congress had the authority to do that kind of thing. Another quick example, right? What was this program we had, less than 2 years ago? The Cash for Clunkers program, right?
Yeah.
Now, how was that program put together? Well, you would get a tax credit if you went and got rid of an older car and bought a new car. Now, the proponents of this said, what was the reason for this? Well, they wanted to stimulate the auto industry, which was having problems, and they said it would be good for the environment because they would get rid of older cars, which aren't as environmentally clean as new cars. Well, if Congress has the authority, as proponents say, to force an individual mandate, well then there was no reason for Congress to have done what they did. What they could have put in is a sell your clunker or else program, in which they forced every American with a car older than a certain age to sell it and buy a new car in order to help stimulate the economy. It's exactly the same kind of power. Now, the other thing the supporters have said of this is, oh look, of course the federal government has authority to do it. This isn't any different in the fact that you have to buy liability insurance to cover your automobile when you drive, right? That is a completely false comparison, because there are 4 major differences between automobile liability insurance and Obamacare. The first one is, not everybody has to buy auto insurance, right? You only have to buy auto insurance if you're the driver. Your passenger doesn't have to buy it. The way Obamacare works, if you're a living, breathing American, you have to buy insurance. The other thing is, you only have to buy liability insurance if you're going to drive your car on a public road. You know, you own a farm, guess what? You know, you can drive your car or your tractor around your farm. You don't have to have insurance. You don't have to have a driver's license. If you want your 12-year-old son to drive, he can do that, and it's not against the law. Also, the only thing states mandate is you have to buy liability insurance that covers injuries and damages that you may cause to somebody else. If you don't want to buy insurance to cover your own injuries or your own damage, you want to just take the risk that, you know, if your car is wrecked, you pay for the damages on your own, guess what? You could do that, right? And in fact, you know, I drive, I guess what the government would consider a clunker, since it's a Honda Accord that's past a certain age. And you know, I don't carry property damage insurance on it anymore, because if I wreck it, it's not worth the liability, the insurance premiums cost, right? The other big difference is this. The framers put together a federal system in which we have a federal government and we have a state government. And state governments have inherent police powers that the federal government does not have. The state governments have more authority over you for things like, auto insurance than the federal government does. I mean, Article 1 of the Constitution allocates all legislative powers herein granted. We have a federal government of enumerated powers, and all powers that are not specifically designated in the Constitution for the federal government are what? They're reserved to the states. Now, the only way that a court could uphold Obamacare is if they were willing to create an entirely new power under the Commerce Clause. And what I'm going to talk about now is the lawsuits that have been filed against us. Now, I know we're in a law school, and I don't want to get bogged down in very technical legal jargon, but I'm going to try to explain this because actually I have to say that most of you probably have a better grasp and understanding of the Constitution than a lot of members of Congress do. Look, there's this whole series of Supreme Court cases on the Commerce Clause. And the Commerce Clause, what does it say? It's Article 1, Section 8, and it simply says that Congress has the authority, quote, to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. Now, anybody know the history of why that provision's in there? I'll tell you why. When we were under the Articles of Confederation, states like Maryland and Virginia, I live in Virginia, work in Washington, they were imposing all these taxes and tariffs on goods coming into their states. So farmers in Virginia and farmers in Maryland were complaining because Virginia farmers had a tough time selling their wheat in Maryland because Maryland was imposing this huge tax on wheat coming in from another state. George Washington called representatives of the state governments in Maryland and Virginia to his home in Mount Vernon to try to work out a deal between them so they would quit doing this. And they realized that they really couldn't work anything out under the Articles of Confederation, and it was that meeting, among other things, that led to the Constitutional Convention. And the whole reason for putting this Commerce Clause in was so that Congress would have the power to make sure that states didn't put up barriers to economic activity. That's why we have this great national economy today that has been the driving force in making us the most successful nation in the history of the world. But what the Supreme Court basically said was that Congress's power to regulate commerce was limited to 3 areas. Okay, the first was they could regulate the channels of interstate commerce. What did that mean? It means they could regulate steamships, railroads, highways, and aircraft, right? Because that's what you need to engage in interstate commerce. The other thing they could do is they could protect the instrumentalities of commerce, like passing laws that don't allow you to destroy an airplane or steal from an interstate shipment. The final thing that Congress could do is they could regulate economic activity that, quote, substantially affects interstate commerce. Okay, and that's the provision that's really at issue in this case. Now, members of Congress like Nancy Pelosi would have you believe, well, there's no limits to what Congress can regulate under the Commerce Clause. You all may recall that as they were passing the bill, a reporter from, I think it was CNN, which is a conservative news service, went up to her and specifically said, where in the Constitution does it give you the authority to pass this health care bill? And her reaction was, are you kidding? The idea that there would be a limit on what Congress can do was just beyond her. Of course, she discovered that the American people weren't kidding about this in November of last year and retired her as being the majority leader. There's a series of lawsuits that have been filed around the country. And we've gotten decisions in so far at the basic trial court level in 5-0. Two of the really bad decisions that were issued, there was one in Michigan that was issued by a judge in which he said there's no problem with Obamacare. The plaintiffs in that case were individual taxpayers who can afford to buy health insurance but chose not to do so. Two said they'd prefer to pay in cash for their health care services. Three objected to receiving medical services or having to purchase insurance based on their religious beliefs. The judge really issued what was really a terrible decision in which he said, well, while plaintiffs describe the Commerce Clause power as reaching economic activity, the government's characterization of the Commerce Clause reaching economic decisions is more accurate. In other words, the Michigan judge said the decisions you make are something that Congress can regulate. A judge in a case filed in the District of Columbia, a woman named Gladys Kessler, who, no surprise, was appointed by Bill Clinton, she actually said that Congress could regulate mental activity. Okay, so yeah, you better watch some of the things you think about the president, because they may come in and try to regulate it. Now, liberals count up these cases, the decisions have been made, and said, ooh, well, there are 3 decisions that have been said that Obamacare is okay, and there's only 2 decisions said it was unconstitutional. Well, litigation is not like a baseball scorecard. Okay? And the thing you'll notice if you read those 3 decisions that said Obamacare is okay is that the orders, the decisions issued by the judge are badly written, they're very cursory. And most important, they were issued at an early stage of the litigation. When a lawsuit is filed, the defendants, one of the first things they can do is they can file what's called a motion to dismiss. And when you file a motion to dismiss, you're basically coming in and saying to the court, look, Your Honor, I know this lawsuit has been filed, but it's totally frivolous. No matter what facts the plaintiffs claim, they don't have a case under the law. And in fact, in all of these cases, that's what the Obama administration has done. The Department of Justice has come in and filed motions to dismiss, basically saying the claims are frivolous. And in these 3 cases where liberal activist judges threw out the claims of unconstitutionality, they were all done at the motion to dismiss stage. So these judges are saying, oh, these claims are frivolous, right? There are 2 other cases which are much more important that have been filed, which have gone the other way. And the reason they are important, I'm going to tell you in just a second. The first one was filed actually in Virginia by Ken Cuccinelli. Ken Cuccinelli is the new Attorney General of Virginia. He was elected last year. They have odd year elections in Virginia. I can tell you, because I know he's a real conservative. And he almost immediately filed a suit against the law. And by the way, great irony of history, he filed the lawsuit in federal court in Richmond. The federal court is literally right down the street from where Patrick Henry gave his famous speech, "Give me liberty or give me death." All right? And the judge issued a great decision. First of all, when the Justice Department came in and filed a motion to dismiss, saying, oh, this is a frivolous claim, the judge denied that motion. So then they went on to the second stage, which is called a motion for summary judgment. That's a stage where both sides file extensive briefs, making their legal arguments about the constitutionality. And the judge came out and said that the law was unconstitutional because Congress does not have the authority to tell individual Americans to buy a product from a private company, which is exactly what the individual mandate is. Ken Cuccinelli actually tells an interesting story about this. I'm not sure he made this argument in the case, but I think it's an argument you ought to hear, which is, remember, prior to the Revolution, what did the American colonists do? They decided to organize, what? A boycott of tea, right? Well, when news of that got to England, King George was very upset about it. And he called in his Solicitor General. The Solicitor General of England was the lawyer who provided advice to the Crown. And King George asked him a question. He said, can we pass a law that would force the American colonists to buy our tea? And the Solicitor General said, well, we don't really have the power to do that. The issue was then brought up in the British Parliament. And although the British Parliament, was very upset over this boycott, they decided that they did not have the power to force Americans to buy tea. So even the most powerful British monarchy, a monarchy that we fought, did not think that the government had the power that liberals and President Obama today believe that our American government has. Now, the Florida case is very important. The decision's been issued, tossing out Obamacare. It's now at the Court of Appeals. But there's another case that is even more important, and that's the lawsuit that was filed in Florida. Okay, the Florida lawsuit was filed by the Florida Attorney General, Bill McCollum, who's also a conservative. But what's important about that case is he was joined by so many other states that, in fact, there are now 26 states in that case. That means that a majority of states have gone to court in this lawsuit. We know it's a majority of states, although I think under President Obama's analysis that we have 57 states, but not even and they were joined by a private party, the NFIB, National Federation of Individual Business, which is the largest trade association representing small businesses in the United States. Now, why is this important? Because while it may not be unprecedented, there is no living memory of a majority of states going to court and claiming that Congress has acted in a way that is not only burdensome but is unconstitutional and beyond their powers. And I can tell you that when all these different cases get to the U.S. Supreme Court, they are going to look at that case that has that many states in it with more, what's the word they kept using the last election, gravitas? Than other cases. On January 31st, again in that case, the Obama Justice Department under Eric Holder came in and said, we ought to just dismiss this case as frivolous. The judge said, no, it's not frivolous. File your legal briefs. And in fact, on January 31st, so not very long ago, Judge Vinson issued an opinion holding the law unconstitutional. His opinion is well researched, it's well written. In fact, one of the best legal opinions I've read in a long time. And in fact, he deals with all of the prior court decisions on the Commerce Clause. What you all need to realize is the Commerce Clause was interpreted in a very conservative way by the Supreme Court until when? The 1930s, right? And in the 1930s, what happened? FDR put in all these new programs that greatly expanded government power. And at first, what happened? The Supreme Court kept issuing decisions saying this is beyond the power of the federal government to do. And then what did FDR do? Well, he came up with his threat of a court packing plan, right? He was going to expand the number of justices on the Supreme Court. And the justices on the Supreme Court suddenly got the message. And they started upholding FDR's new programs. But the point of Judge Vinson's decision is that even if you take the court decisions that were issued by the Supreme Court that expanded the Commerce Clause, what Congress is now trying to do with Obamacare is so far beyond that that it's unconstitutional. The most famous case that expanded the Commerce Clause was a case that if you ask any lawyer in law school about it, they'll know this case right away. It was a case called Wickard versus Filbert. issued in 1942. And it was a case where, remember, FDR set up this whole new administration to regulate farming in the United States, right? They started telling farmers how many acres they could plant, what their prices would be. And this wheat farmer, he was allocated 11 acres by the federal government to grow wheat. He said, okay, I'm going to grow 11 acres, but he then planted another 12 acres of wheat. And the federal government came in and said, you can't do that. You know, you've been allocated 11 acres, you can't plant another 12 acres. Now the farmer said, well look, I'm not going to sell the wheat I grow on that 12 acres of land. I'm just going to use that for my own family and to feed my own animals. It's not going to enter into intrastate commerce, which is commerce within the state. The Supreme Court said that no, the government could regulate what the farmer was doing because he was engaging in economic activity. That economic activity would affect commerce within that state, which then could affect interstate commerce. Now, look, my own opinion is that that decision was quite a stretch, and I don't think it was really wrong, but you know, that's what the Supreme Court decided, and that's what the law is today. But as Judge Vinson pointed out, look, in 1942, the Supreme Court said you could regulate it because what did the farmer do? He made a decision to engage in activity, right? Growing wheat. Here, the government wants to regulate you not because you're engaging in some activity, but because you're deciding not to engage in activity, which is purchasing health insurance. Basically, for 50 years, the Supreme Court said yes every time Congress did anything under the Commerce Clause. And all of this suddenly ended and was checked in 1995, when for the first time in 50 years, the Supreme Court came out with a decision that said that Congress had gone too far. And what was the case? The case was called U.S. versus Lopez. And it was this federal law that was passed by Congress that prohibited the possession of a gun in a school zone. Now, you know, you may think that's a good idea from a public policy standpoint. And you know, if a state, like the state of Massachusetts, wants to pass a law like that, it's probably within their inherent police powers to do it. But the Congress, the Supreme Court said, Congress didn't have the authority to do that because it would convert the Commerce Clause into a general police power, which the federal government doesn't have, and so Congress couldn't do it. I mean, liberals were just appalled that the Supreme Court had done this, but from the standpoint of the way the Constitution works, it makes perfect sense. In 2005, they issued another decision like this, which also, again, really appalled liberals. It was called U.S. versus Lopez. And in that case, Congress had passed a federal law called the Violence Against Women Act, right, which allowed federal prosecutors to come in and prosecute individuals, you know, men who assaulted women. Now, obviously, that's a good law if it's passed by a state. And, you know, those kind of state prosecutions, you know, assault, things like that, that's obviously a state matter. It's not a federal matter. And what the Supreme Court said was that Congress was trying to regulate activity under the Commerce Clause that had absolutely nothing to do with economic activity. Because while, you know, violence against women is obviously wrong, it has nothing to do with economic activity. And Congress said that this would totally, basically, expand the commerce power so that there would be no limits on what Congress could do. What Judge Vinson said in this case about Obamacare, I don't want to give you a lot of quotes, but I want to read you this. What he said was that it falls outside the boundary of Congress's Commerce Clause authority and cannot be reconciled with a limited government of enumerated powers. The other thing that he gave is, I think this is the best quote in the whole opinion. It's like 78 pages. He said this. Vinson says, let me read you this. It is difficult to imagine that a nation which began, at least in part, as the result of opposition to a British mandate giving the East India Company a monopoly and imposing a tax on all tea sold in America, would have set out to create a government with the power to force people to buy tea in the first place. If Congress can penalize a passive individual for failing to engage in commerce, the enumeration of powers in the Constitution would have been in vain, for it would have been difficult to perceive any limitation on federal power, and we would have a Constitution in name only. In fact, you remember this is a second iteration of Obamacare. Remember in 1994, Hillary Clinton tried to get the same thing passed. And at that time, the Congressional Budget Office was asked to do a study, and they did a study about this. And the Congressional Budget Office then said, quote, "A mandate requiring all individuals to purchase health insurance would be an unprecedented form of federal action. The government has never required people to buy any good or service as a condition of lawful residence in the United States." So even CBO at that time agreed. Now the other key thing about the Florida decision was this. When Obamacare was passed, I mean, it's 2,000 pages, it has so much stuff in it that I still haven't been able to read through the whole thing. Okay? But the one thing it was missing, they threw in everything, including the kitchen sink, into this. But the one thing it was missing was a severability clause. What's a severability clause? Congress routinely puts this very standard clause in the bills they pass that says, if any particular part of this law is found unconstitutional by a court, the rest of the law is still okay. The only thing the court decision does is excise or delete that one particular piece of the bill. There was no severability clause in this provision. In fact, the judge pointed out that there was a severability clause in an earlier version, but Congress intentionally took it out. So the final version that was passed had no severability clause. And so what Vincent said was the individual mandate is such an essential part of this bill, as President Obama has said, and as the sponsors have said, that because I'm finding the individual mandate to be unconstitutional, the entire law is unconstitutional and thrown out. DOJ and the Obama administration didn't want to accept what the judge had said. And about 2.5 weeks later, on February 17th, they filed this really bizarre motion. It was called a motion to clarify. I've been practicing for, I better not say how long I've been practicing. I know how old I am, but I've been practicing a long time. I have never seen a motion to clarify. And basically, they filed this almost insulting motion to Judge Vincent saying, well, you really couldn't have meant what you said when you said it was unconstitutional. Would you please clarify your order? And they asked the judge to clarify, quote, that the executive branch was really enjoined from implementing the law. Well, Judge Vincent then issued an order saying, well, if they really didn't understand my order, why did they wait 2.5 weeks to ask me about it? Well, in the brief, the DOJ lawyers had said that, well, the reason for the delay was because Vincent's prior order needed, quote unquote, careful analysis. Okay, well, Judge Vincent pointed out that this was, quote, contrary to media reports that the White House declared within hours of Vincent's original ruling that it was going to implement the law regardless of Vincent's ruling. So basically, the DOJ lawyers lied in the brief. And in fact, they put such lies in the brief that Vincent, in the same order, said that the government's legal arguments bordered on misrepresentation, which is one of the most serious charges of misbehavior a judge can make against you. Vincent issued an order saying that he would only stay his decision, which means it doesn't go into effect, if the Obama administration immediately filed an appeal with the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, which covers Florida, and they asked it for expedited review. Courts of appeals work, very slowly. They're kind of still in the stagecoach days of doing things. But you can ask a court for expedited review, which means they put it on a fast schedule. DOJ did file an appeal almost immediately, but the schedule they asked the judge to put in was not expedited. It was about as slow as you could be for review, because they clearly want to delay this litigation from going forward, because they want the decision to come out when? After the election. Okay. Well, the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals ignored what DOJ requested and put it on a fast track. And in fact, the oral argument, so that's when both sides will appear before the Court of Appeals and make their arguments to the judge, is going to be June 8th. What that means is that in the Florida case, the Virginia case, we're going to get a decision sometime this summer. And when we get a decision this summer, that means that it will be appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, and it'll be before the U.S. Supreme Court this fall. So there's no question, something could delay it. There's no question in my mind, we're going to get a decision from the U.S. Supreme Court before the election. I think there's a very good chance that, in fact, I think the probability is high, the Supreme Court's going to uphold what the Florida judge said and what the Virginia judge said, and they're going to find it unconstitutional. Now, I got to tell you, it's going to be a 5-4 decision, which tells you how important judgeships are on the U.S. Supreme Court. I got to say this, if the case goes the other way, I think it will be one of the most dangerous developments in our history. Because it will mean, as I've said before, that there is literally no limit on the power of the federal government. This law represents what I think is a dire threat to our whole concept of liberty and freedom. And what's sad about this is that we are dependent on 5 justices of the Supreme Court, not the president, not members of Congress, all of whom do not understand their obligation and the oath that every one of them takes before you become president, before you become a member of Congress, to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. I want to end with a personal story that is important to this issue. As you all could tell from my name, Von Spakovsky, I'm not around here. Actually, I was raised in Alabama, but my parents are immigrants. I'm a first-generation American. Okay? My mother grew up in Nazi Germany. My father was Russian. He escaped the communists twice. And I can tell you, when I was a kid growing up in Alabama, during the day I was a typical American kid, playing baseball and doing everything that our kids like to do. But when I would come home at night, around the dinner table, I would hear stories from my parents and my German grandmother about what life was like in tyranny. And the one thing that my parents told all their children was how important it is that every citizen watch their government, and how every citizen has a duty and an obligation to protect the liberty and freedom that is so important to the nation that we are today. I don't intend to see this country go down without a fight, and I know that all of you feel exactly the same way. So I congratulate you on all the work you've done, and I know that you're going to continue to do it. And I'll be happy to answer questions, if we still have time. All right, thanks. Yes, sir.
Do you think that the 100 exceptions to needing Obamacare, which have been given to unions and other people, will play into the constitutionality issue?
I think that's possible. If you all didn't hear the question, they've given like 1,000. The Secretary of HHS, Health and Human Services, right? Kathleen Sebelius, who, by the way, is a former trial lawyer and was head of the Tort Lawyers Association in Kansas before she became governor. Anyway, she was given the ability to give waivers to employers and others from meeting all the very strict requirements for particular types of coverage set out in the law. They've given over 1,000 waivers, not just 100. I think it's over 1,000 now. And a huge number of those waivers, in fact a very large percentage, were given to unions who do not want to meet these requirements under this law that, as you know, they spend a lot of money trying to get passed. I do think that raises a potential equal protection problem. You know, whether that particular problem hasn't been briefed in the court cases because that's a relatively new development. And I don't know whether or not that's going to get discussed or briefed in the courts, but it's a potential problem. Yes, ma'am.
How about the fact that the people who are trying to stuff this down our throats are not covered by it? The Congress?
Well, that's probably, as a taxpayer, I would be upset about that, but from a legal standpoint, that's probably not an argument against it because, as many of you probably know, Congress has exempted itself for 200 and something years from most of the laws that it passed. In fact, one of the first times that was changed was when Newt Gingrich became Speaker of the House, right, in '94. And they started making changes to some of the laws that they passed and said they would apply to Congress. One of the chief ones was, you know, all the laws that were passed in the Civil Rights era to prevent discrimination in employment, none of those applied to Congress. So members of Congress could do whatever the heck they wanted to their employees, and that was actually one of the things the Republican majority, when they came in, they changed that. Yes, sir.
Regarding the Supreme Court final decision on this one, you said 5-4, but didn't we just have a decision where some of the liberals voted the right way on the freedom of speech on that Westboro Baptist thing? Didn't we get a couple of our Massachusetts Supreme Court justices to vote correct way, which is freedom of speech? Couldn't they maybe vote the right way on Obamacare because it is a definite freedom decision?
I don't think so. During the confirmation hearings of Justice Elena Kagan, who, as you know, used to be dean of the Little Red Schoolhouse in Cambridge, the law school there. One of the senators, I don't remember which one it was, asked her, well, do you believe that Congress could pass a law that forced all Americans to buy and eat broccoli every day? Okay? Because, you know, the concept is exactly the same as here. And, you know, her answer, she did not come out and say, well, no, of course Congress doesn't have that. No, her answer was, well, that would really be a stupid law. But, I mean, she basically was agreeing that Congress had the power to do that. And I can tell you that Justice Sotomayor, also, who, as you know, is a new justice, she is a results-oriented, extremely liberal judge. And there's just no way, I can tell you, I would bet my next year's salary on it, but there's no way that they will, there are no arguments that you could make to them that would change their mind and make them say that Obamacare is unconstitutional. I hope I'm wrong, and it turns out that I've completely predicted this the wrong way, but I don't believe it. Yeah.
What about, I don't know if you saw the op-ed by Larry Tribe recently, where he makes the argument roughly that there's all kinds of individual mandates that Congress has imposed in other contexts. You know, for example, the draft is an individual mandate. Everybody had to go into the military at one point or another. And that there was an overall emergency, so to speak, that might warrant this kind of approach. And in effect suggesting that there should be new direction taken under the Commerce Clause. What do you think of that, and do you think that's tailored to convince Justice Kennedy?
Well, I hope it doesn't convince Justice Kennedy. As most of you probably know, when Justice O'Connor retired, thank goodness, and we got a great new justice, Justice Alito, on the bench, and Justice Roberts also. Justice Kennedy became the swing vote. I don't buy Lawrence Tribe's argument because, look, he's making this general argument about all these different individual mandates, but you have to track them back to a particular enumerated power, right? What is the number one power and duty of the federal government, right? It's to protect the United States from foreign attack. And if you look at the Constitution and you look at the enumerated powers set out to Congress, and you look at the powers given to the President as Commander-in-Chief, the authority in wartime is tremendously greater than all kinds of other authority that the government has. And I think you can track the ability of Congress to impose a draft to that. That doesn't mean that because Congress has the ability to impose a draft in wartime, that it can impose individual mandates in all kinds of other areas. So I think just as a general argument, I don't agree with that. Yes, ma'am.
When Robert Alt was speaking to us at the MCFL caucus in Washington, he cautioned us about just assuming, even with the lack of the severability clause, that the whole law would fall if the individual mandate was ruled unconstitutional. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, no, I mean, I'm not going to go against what Robert said. Robert Alt is one of the other lawyers I work with at the Heritage Foundation, very, very smart guy. And no, he's right. That, I mean, it's possible that even if this got to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court upheld the Florida judge's ruling that the individual mandate is unconstitutional, I mean, they might change they might, on the other hand, say that, no, we do think it's severable, even though there's not a severability clause. And they might come out and say, well, the rest of it is okay. The thing is, even if they do that, it hopefully will be tough for the administration to keep going forward with this, because that, as they said, is correct. I mean, that mandate is really essential to making all the other parts of this work. So I'm hopeful that even if the Supreme Court ruled the wrong way on that, it would help, it'll help take this down. But the other thing that needs to happen is this. Look, if you look at the history of Congress, you'll see that in the past, Congress has actually passed all kinds of laws that don't really have any effect. Why? Because Congress always has to do two things. One, first they have to pass a law, and then second, they have to appropriate the money that pays for whatever the law is about. And if they don't appropriate the money, there are laws on the books in Washington where they never appropriate the money, and so the laws don't mean anything. They're sitting there, but they've never been enforced or anything else done with them. And the second part of this, you know, we've got this litigation going forward, but the other thing that's got to happen is Congress has got to stop and make sure that no money is appropriated to implement any of these provisions, and that includes cutting budgets, for example, at Health and Human Services, to be sure there's no money to implement any of the 100 and something boards and commissions that have put in to put this in place.
During the last election of the members of Congress who came in this current Congress, it's said that 90% of them are pro-life and social conservatives. If that trend continues, when will Congress finally accept their responsibility to set jurisdiction over 95% of all the issues? Because as you well know, in the Constitution, the only jurisdiction that the Supreme Court and the federal courts have is over issues of foreign treaties and interstate commerce. When will Congress, I think we're at a point where Congress can soon take this jurisdiction away and certainly repeal the law itself.
You're asking me to predict when Congress will act, and you know, that's tougher than predicting.
We need to elect men and women who have a background.
Well, that's true. But look, the other thing that's going on is You know, everybody talked about what happened in November, right? Where there was the biggest change in Congress since the 1938 elections, right? But there was also the biggest change in state legislatures, also in probably the same amount of time. And there are bills being passed all over in states where conservatives took over on abortion. Just, I think yesterday in Virginia, where I live, the legislature passed and the governor is going to sign a law that says that all clinics that provide abortion services have to meet the exact same standards as other medical clinics, which, you know, whether you're for or against abortion, that makes perfect sense, right? I mean, there are these medical, surgical procedures being done, and why in the world would you say that they don't have to meet those kind of procedures? And it's stuff like that. The Democrats voted in the state legislature voted against it because they said, oh my gosh, if the clinics have to meet those standards, it'll close every abortion clinic in the state. And I was sitting there going, yeah, so what's the problem? Yes, ma'am.
What about those individuals who refuse to sign up for Obamacare,
Right.
refuse to go ahead and get an insurer? What will be the penalty for these thousands of people that I believe are going to refuse this?
There's a specific monetary penalty in the law that says if you don't get it, you'll have to pay this amount in penalty to the IRS. Off the top of my head, I don't remember how much it is, but there's a specific amount laid out in the statute.
If they refuse to pay it, and one reason is they may not have it, but they refuse to pay it, this could get very sticky and very expensive.
Yes. Sorry, simple answer, but that's correct, yes. Yeah, right.
First of all, on conscription, I think we didn't have military conscription until Civil War,
That's right.
and even and that was during wartime. Plus, it was very unpopular.
Yeah, I think there were riots in New York over it.
My question is, do you think a healthcare law applying only to minors would be constitutional?
Are you talking about like the CHIPS law that they passed?
You had medical insurance for minors.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I'd have to look at the details of it to see. I mean, you know, it's one thing if the government says it's going to provide health insurance, as we've done, for example, for Medicare, right, which covers many people. It's quite another thing to say you have to purchase insurance. And I think there would be the same problems with that if Congress passed a law saying all parents have to purchase insurance to cover their children. Because, look, if you have the money to pay for it in cash, you know, how does the government have the right to tell you you have to do it? I think that brings up many of the same problems. Yeah.
Yes, you spoke, of course, about the federal Obamacare bill. As my friend Charlie just reminded me, we have something that's called Romneycare by some in Massachusetts. I wonder if you, assuming you know some of the details at least of the Massachusetts version, if you compare the two situations.
I can't really do that because no, I don't. I've been following closely the litigation going on with the federal case, but I'll be the first to tell you that I don't know enough about Romneycare to really comment on it. Look, I'm a lawyer. I do lawyer stuff at Heritage. We have this whole separate unit of people who all they study is healthcare, and they could tell you, I'm sure, down to the smallest detail. But unfortunately, I can't.
Specifically, you're wondering about the mandate and the penalty, which I think is very similar to what you described in the Obamacare.
Remember, states have a police power that the federal government does not have. So, you know, it very well may be that under the Massachusetts Constitution and the common law as it's developed here, that the government has the authority to do that. But I don't know Massachusetts law well enough to give you an opinion.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
I'd like to, if you can answer, bringing this whole Obamacare thing back to the issues of life, whether or not it's constitutional, whether or not it remains law or gets overturned, can you speak to how that would affect abortion, stem cell research, and euthanasia? Like
I could do it just briefly, and in fact, if you all are interested in this, this is not in your handouts, but Heritage has actually done a couple of web memos, which you can get on our website. This one is called Abortion Coverage in President Obama's Healthcare Reform Bill. And it kind of goes through that issue. And we have another one on Obamacare and the ethics of life, weakening medical conscience and the protection of life. You know, if you ask the White House, they'll tell you, oh yeah, there's nothing in the bill that helps pay for abortion, but that's not really true. If you look if you get down into the details, and you know, an old saying, there's the devil's in the details, right? There are provisions in the law that would unfortunately facilitate abortion. And I'll give you an example of just one of them. There's a provision in the law that appropriates $11 billion to underwrite the operation and construction of what they call community health centers. This money is appropriated to the annual spending bill of HHS, Health and Human Services, right? So Health and Human Services could designate what kind of services will be provided in those community health centers and paid for by the government. Well, if HHS does it, the head of HHS, Catholic, if she doesn't put a restriction in on abortion services, then it's potentially true they could provide abortion services. I'll give you one more, and that is, let me find it real quick. Oh yeah, the Office of Personnel Management, which got a lot of responsibilities under this law. Boy, they have a lot of experience with health insurance. That's the HR department of the federal government. They're supposed to contract with private insurers to offer at least 2 multi-state health insurance plans in each state. Now, by law, at least one of the plans has to exclude abortion coverage, but OPM has the discretion to organize and promote the other multi-state plans so that it includes elective abortion coverage.
Wow.
Okay, so there's provisions throughout this whole law that could facilitate and encourage abortions and end up having federal money pay for it, despite what you hear from the White House. All right, is that?
Yeah, we're getting close. I'm going to use a privilege.
Okay.
What about Justice Kagan and recusing herself?
Well, that's an interesting issue. You know, during Justice Kagan's confirmation hearings, you all recall that she went from being dean of the Harvard Law School to being the Solicitor General of the United States. The Solicitor General is the Justice Department official who is the representative of the United States before the U.S. Supreme Court. That's all the Solicitor General does. As a kind of a side note, I was actually in the courtroom at the Supreme Court when she argued her first case, and it happened to be the Citizens United decision. By the way, that was not just the first case she had ever argued on behalf of the United States Solicitor General. As I understand it, it's the first case she'd ever argued in a courtroom. You know, she was a law professor for a long time, never got to court. She was asked by Republicans on the Senate Judiciary Committee, which is charged for confirmation, for a list of all cases that she had worked on as the Solicitor General of the Obama administration, because any cases that she had been consulted on or had provided advice on, she would have to recuse herself if that case came before her as a justice. She listed a whole series of cases. She did not list Obamacare. Now, I have to tell you, I have a difficult time believing that the Solicitor General was not consulted over the constitutionality of this, what is the most complex federal legislation ever passed in our entire history. So, you know, according to what she said to the Senate Judiciary Committee, you know, she didn't list it as one of the cases that she is going to recuse herself on. Like I said, I have a difficult time believing she shouldn't, but the way things are going now, she may not do that. And there's nobody who can force a Supreme Court justice to recuse themselves other than, you know, pressure from fellow justices say, well, you really need to recuse yourself from the case.
Very